Ruined Millionaire was ready to give up. The maid's mute baby showed a drawing that changed everything. He was about to sign bankruptcy when the child entered with chalk-stained hands. What looked like a doodle was actually a silent code that exposed everything. And in that moment, everything changed. Contracts, power, and the businessman's own heart. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us what city you're watching from. And now, to continue. The fine drizzle of the September morning painted the main office windows with blurry strokes, as if the city of New York itself were weeping along with Robert A. Thompson. He stood there before the mahogany desk that had belonged to his grandfather, then his father, and which would now witness the end of everything. 62 years of history about to be sold for a fraction of what it was truly worth. Around him, stacks of documents awaited only a signature that would erase 3 generations of work, of dreams, of late nights, dedicated to building something bigger than any of them. Robert was 43, but at that moment, he seemed to carry the weight of an entire century. His brown eyes, once always lit with the passion he had inherited from his father, now reflected only exhaustion. Exhaustion from fighting against something he couldn't comprehend. How had it all fallen apart so quickly? Just 6 months ago, the Thompson Hotel Group was synonymous with excellence across the United States. 23 properties spread across the country's major cities, over 3,000 employees, international hospitality awards. His grandfather, Sebastian Thompson, had started with a small inn in Newport, Rhode Island, in the 60s. His father, Albert, had expanded to New York and then across the country. And he, Robert, was supposed to have been the guardian of that legacy. Supposed to have been. The past tense already hurt like an open wound. He glanced at the clock on the wall, 10:15 in the morning. In 45 minutes the foreign group would arrive. Executives from Miami representing an investment fund that had sniffed out the crisis, like vultures over a carcass. The offer was ridiculous, less than 40% of the company's real value. But what could he do? The debts had appeared like ghosts in the night. Suppliers who had always been loyal were suddenly cancelling contracts. Banks that had never questioned anything began refusing to renew lines of credit. And worst of all, the rumors. Business journals published articles about supposed mismanagement, about tax irregularities he had never committed, about an imminent bankruptcy that seemed to have been announced before he even knew it existed. The office door opened with a soft creak. Paul, Henry entered first. The company's accountant for 15 years, a man in his early 50s, thin, always wearing gold-rimmed glasses, and a serious expression that never hid what he was thinking. He carried yet another folder of documents. Right behind him came Michael Rivers, the family lawyer, someone who had known Robert since he was a child, who had played baseball with him during summers in Newport. Michael's face was grim, but his eyes showed a deep sadness. He knew what that signature meant. It wasn't just the end of a company, it was the end of thousands of jobs, of stories, of lives that depended on that hotel chain to survive. Last to enter was Fabian Mendoza, a minority partner in the company, but a long-time associate. Fabian was a few years older than Robert and had joined the business 12 years ago when he invested a significant sum that helped with the expansion into Florida. Since then, he had always been present in important decisions. Tall, broad-shouldered, with well-cut greying hair, Fabian had the look of someone who was always in control. And it was precisely this serenity that was beginning to bother Robert. While everyone else there seemed devastated, Fabian maintained an almost irritating calm, as if this were all just another business transaction. "Robert, you need to sign here, here, and here," Paul Henry said, pointing to the yellow tabs on the documents. His voice had an almost imperceptible tremor. "The transfer of controlling shares will be effective as soon as the payment is confirmed. They'll deposit the funds in 2 installments, the first today, the second in 60 days. "And the employees?" Robert asked, his voice hoarse. "What's going to happen to them?" Michael sighed, running a hand over his face. "They've promised to keep at least 60% of the staff for the next 6 months. After that, no guarantees. They'll probably restructure everything, bring in their own people, change the operation." 60%. Robert felt his stomach churn. That meant 1,200 people would lose their jobs immediately. 1,200 families. He knew many of them. He had grown up visiting the hotels with his father, knew housekeepers who had worked there for 20 years, receptionists who had watched their children grow up while working for the Thompsons. And now he would be remembered as the man who destroyed it all. "This isn't right," Robert muttered, more to himself than to the others. "None of this is right. I've reviewed the financials 1,000 times. There were no debts of this magnitude. There was no reason for us to get to this point." Fabian, who until then had remained silent, leaning against the wall, stepped forward. "Robert, we've talked about this. Sometimes things just don't work out. The market changed, competition increased, some investments didn't pan out. It happens. The important thing now is to minimize the damage. This sale is the only way to avoid losing everything." There was something in the way Fabian spoke that sounded almost too reassuring, almost rehearsed. Robert looked up at him, trying to decipher that placid expression, but was interrupted by his secretary appearing at the door. "Mr. Thompson, the representatives from the group have arrived. They're being shown to the conference room." Robert nodded, his legs feeling heavy. "This is it then. Let's get this over with." They walked in silence through the corridors of the 15th floor. The Thompson Group's headquarters was located in Midtown Manhattan, a modern commercial building that housed not only the administrative offices, but also a small boutique hotel on the upper floors. Each step echoed like a farewell. Employees who passed them in the hallway averted their gaze, already knowing what was about to happen. The rumors traveled faster than any official announcement. The conference room had a huge glass table, black leather chairs, and a panoramic view of the city. Outside, New York carried on at its frantic pace, indifferent to the drama unfolding within. The three executives from the foreign group were already seated, laptops open, their expressions professional and cold. One of them, a man in a navy blue suit and red tie, stood up to greet Robert. "Mr. Thompson, thank you for having us. I believe everything is ready to finalize the transaction." Robert shook his hand without enthusiasm, feeling the coldness of that calculated grip. These men didn't care about the company's history, about the lives that would be affected. To them, it was just numbers on a spreadsheet, an undervalued asset that could be resold for a profit in a few years. Everyone sat down. Paul Henry began distributing copies of the contracts. Michael made notes on a legal pad, reviewing clauses one last time. Fabian maintained that relaxed posture, as if he were just watching everything from a distance, and Robert, at the center of it all, felt like a stranger in his own life. "Mr. Thompson, if you could sign here on the first page, then on pages 17, 32, and 45, the executive in the red tie instructed, pushing the document toward him. Robert picked up the pen, a Mont Blanc pen that had been a gift from his father the day he officially took over as president of the company. He held it, feeling the weight of the metal, the weight of the decisions, the weight of failure. He brought the tip of the pen to the paper. The letters seemed to dance before his blurry eyes. 3 generations, 62 years, 3,000 employees, all reduced to a signature. It was at that exact moment that the door opened. No one expected it. The conference room door was closed, with the secretary outside under express instructions not to allow any interruptions. But there she was, a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old, small, thin, with brown hair tied in a messy ponytail. She wore a pink t-shirt with butterfly designs and a pair of faded jeans. Her hands were smudged with colored chalk, yellow, green, blue, and she was holding something, a crumpled piece of paper clearly pulled from a trash can. The edges were folded, and there were coffee stains on one corner. The girl entered with hesitant steps, her large, dark eyes fixed on Robert. She said nothing, not a word. She just walked up to him, held out the paper, and stood there, waiting. The silence in the room was absolute. The foreign executives exchanged confused glances. Paul Henry stood up, trying to understand what was happening. Michael frowned. Fabian, for the first time, lost a bit of his serenity, his eyes narrowing as he saw the child. "How did you get in here?" one of the executives asked in English, visibly annoyed. But the girl didn't answer. She just stood there, with the paper extended, her eyes fixed on Robert. There was something in that gaze, a silent urgency, a mute plea. Robert, without understanding why, took the paper from her hands. At the same instant, the door opened again, and a woman rushed in, her face flushed with embarrassment and worry. "Sophia, I'm so sorry. She ran away from me. I didn't know she came in here. Please forgive me, sir. I didn't." The woman was young, probably in her early 30s, with dark hair tied in a simple bun, wearing the blue uniform of the cleaning staff. She took the girl's hand, trying to pull her out of the room, but Robert raised a hand asking her to wait. "It's all right," he said, his voice strangely calm. "Just a moment." Robert unfolded the crumpled paper. The first thing he saw were childish drawings, flowers drawn with red crayon, a yellow sun in the top corner, blue stars. But underneath the drawings there was something else: numbers, graphs, tables. Initially he thought they were just meaningless scribbles, imitations of things the child might have seen somewhere. But something made him look closer. "Paul, can you come here for a second?" Robert called, and there was a note of urgency in his voice that made the accountant approach immediately. Paul took the paper, adjusted his glasses, and began to examine it. His eyes widened. He took out his phone, opened a spreadsheet, compared numbers. He looked back at the paper, and then, slowly, very slowly, he raised his gaze to Robert. "Where did you get this?" Paul asked the woman in the blue uniform, his voice trembling. She found it in the trash," the woman replied hesitantly. "I work here overnight, on the cleaning crew. Sophia stays with me because I have no one to leave her with. She found this last night. I looked at it and I studied accounting, you know, a long time ago, before I had to stop. And these numbers, they seemed strange, important. I didn't know what to do. When she saw I was worried, she drew over it as if to show it to someone. And this morning, when I came to drop her off with my mother, she ran away from me and came in here." Paul Henry turned to Robert, and there was something on his face that Robert couldn't decipher. It was shock, it was confusion, it was anger. "Robert, this data here, it's real. These are updated company numbers, but they're not the same ones I saw in the reports we used as the basis for this sale." "What do you mean they're not the same?" Robert felt his heart race. "These numbers show that that company is not only viable but has growth potential. The debts listed here are related to investments that have already been paid off. The contracts that were allegedly cancelled appear here as assets. Robert, if this data is correct, the reports I received were falsified." The silence that followed was deafening. Robert felt as if the floor had disappeared from under his feet. Falsified. The word echoed in his mind like an alarm bell. He looked up and swept his gaze across the room. The foreign executives looked uncomfortable, speaking to each other in low voices in English. Michael was pale, his hands trembling. Paul held the paper as if it were a bomb about to explode. And Fabian. Fabian had risen from his chair, his face suddenly tense, his serenity finally cracked like a falling mask. "This is ridiculous," Fabian said, his voice a little too loud. "You're going to believe some scribbles from a child found in the trash? This is insane. Robert, sign these papers now. We're wasting time." But there was something in Fabian's urgency that sounded wrong. Robert looked at him, really looked, and for the first time in months he felt he was seeing beyond the surface. The coldness in those eyes, the poorly disguised impatience, the way his hands were clenched into fists. "Paul," Robert said, his voice firm, "I want a full audit, now. I want every number reviewed, every document verified, every report cross-checked with the original sources." "Robert, you can't be serious," Fabian protested. "These men traveled all the way from Miami. We have a deal." "A deal based on what?" Robert stood up, feeling something awaken inside him. An anger, a clarity. "Based on reports that are apparently wrong. Fabian, if there is any chance, no matter how small, that this sale is being made based on false information, I am not signing anything until I am absolutely certain." The foreign executives stood up, visibly irritated. One of them started to say something about lawsuits and breach of contract, but Michael, the lawyer, intervened with legal arguments about due diligence and the right to verify data. The room descended into chaos. Voices overlapped, Fabian trying to argue. Paul on the phone asking his accounting team to come immediately, the foreigners threatening to leave. In the midst of it all, Robert looked at the woman in the blue uniform and the little girl. The woman held her daughter's hand tightly, her eyes wide at the turmoil she had unintentionally caused. The girl, Sophia, was quiet, still looking at Robert with those deep, silent eyes. Something in that gaze said she knew. Somehow this child who couldn't speak knew she had delivered more than just a piece of paper. She had delivered a chance. "What's your name?" Robert asked the woman, crouching down to be at the girl's level. "Marina, sir. Marina Silver. And this is Sophia, my daughter." "Marina," Robert said, and there was a gratitude in his voice he couldn't hide. "I need you to stay here. I need you to help us understand these numbers. You said you studied accounting." Marina nodded nervously. "I did, yes. I did 3 years at the university, but I had to stop when I got pregnant. I couldn't afford to continue. I started working here 2 years ago, the night shift, because that's when Sophia can be with me without causing too much trouble. She doesn't speak, you know. She was born mute, and I have no one to leave her with." Robert nodded, feeling something stir in his chest. This woman, this cleaning lady he had probably passed dozens of times in the hallways without really seeing, had been responsible for this discovery. And her daughter, a silent child with chalk-stained hands, had been the messenger. "Paul, arrange a room for Marina. I want her to work with your team. We're going to review everything, absolutely everything." Fabian took a step forward, his face red. "Robert, this is a mistake. A huge mistake. You're letting this sale fall apart because of a piece of paper found in the trash. You're being irrational." "Maybe I am," Robert replied, staring at his partner. "Or maybe I'm finally starting to see things clearly. Fabian, if you have a problem with this, you can leave, but I am not signing anything today." The foreign executive stormed out of the room, slamming the door. Threats were made. Deadlines were mentioned. But Robert didn't move. For the first time in 6 months, he felt he was making the right decision. He didn't yet know what that paper fully meant. He didn't know if Marina and her daughter had truly found something relevant, or if it was all a misunderstanding. But he knew with a certainty that came from somewhere deep inside him that signing those papers at that moment would have been the biggest mistake of his life. Fabian left the room without another word, but not before casting a cold glance at Marina and Sophia, a look that Robert did not fail to notice. Marina held her daughter tighter, as if sensing the danger in that gaze, and Sophia, still silent, squeezed her mother's hand back, her eyes now fixed on the door through which Fabian had departed. The storm was just beginning, but for the first time Robert felt he wasn't facing it alone. There, in that room, was a woman who dared to see beyond what she was supposed to, and a child who had found a way to shout without needing words. And together, maybe, just maybe, they could uncover the truth hidden beneath layers of lies that had almost destroyed everything. Outside, the fine New York rain continued to fall, but inside something had changed. The end had been postponed. And with that postponement came the most dangerous thing of all: hope. The hours that followed that September morning were a whirlwind of discoveries and confrontations that Robert had never imagined possible. The accounting department on the 12th floor was transformed into a makeshift operations center. Paul Henry summoned his entire team, including 2 trusted external auditors. Marina was set up at a desk by the window, with Sophia sitting quietly in a swivel chair, drawing on sheets of paper that employees kindly offered her. The girl seemed oblivious to the chaos around her, focused on her colorful creations, but every now and then she would look up and watch everything with an attention that seemed far too old for her age. Marina worked with an intensity that impressed everyone around. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she checked spreadsheets, cross-referenced data, and pointed out inconsistencies. Despite the years away from the university, despite having spent the last few years pushing cleaning carts through empty hallways at dawn, she demonstrated a technical mastery that rivaled the most experienced accountants on the team. Paul Henry, initially skeptical, soon found himself consulting her on interpretations of complex accounting entries. Here, Marina pointed at the computer screen, with Paul leaning over her shoulder to see better. These vendor payments are duplicated, Same amount, same recipient, but posted to 2 different accounts. If you add it all up, it looks like the company spent twice what it actually did. Paul adjusted his glasses, his face growing paler. And here, Marina continued, moving to another spreadsheet, these contracts that were supposedly cancelled, they're active. The payments are still coming in, but they were recorded as losses. How is this possible? Robert had asked, his voice tense, standing behind them, observing the screens. How did no one notice this before? Paul swallowed hard. Because I received the reports already consolidated, always from Fabian. He said it was to streamline the process, to keep you from wasting time on operational details. I would check the numbers against the banks, against the tax filings, and everything matched. But I realize now he was only giving me specific pieces of the data, never the complete files. Robert felt anger swell like a wave inside him. Fabian, his partner of 12 years, the man who had been by his side in difficult times, who knew every detail of the business, who had access to everything. The betrayal wasn't just financial, it was personal. It was a knife in the back of a trust Robert had believed to be unbreakable. Where is he? Robert asked, his voice dangerously low. Has anyone seen Fabian? He left the building right after the meeting, answered Michael, who had entered the room. He sent a text saying he had urgent appointments. He's not answering his phone. Of course he isn't, Paul muttered, running a hand over his face. He knows we've found him out. Robert, this goes far beyond accounting errors. This is systematic fraud, planned over several years. Marina intervened, her voice hesitant but firm. There's more. I found transfers to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands, significant amounts, always classified as consulting or strategic investments, but when you try to trace the origin or the final destination, the information is deliberately obscure. Robert pulled up a chair and sat down heavily. His mind was working at a frantic pace, trying to piece it all together. How many years has this been going on? From what I've been able to trace so far, Marina said, looking at her notes, at least 3 years, maybe more. It's hard to be sure without full access to all the files. 3 years. 3 years of lies. 3 years in which Fabian had systematically siphoned off funds, manipulated reports, and built a false narrative of decline to justify the sale. And Robert, trusting, had believed every word. He had questioned himself, doubted his ability as a manager, shouldered the blame for failures that never existed. Michael's phone rang. He answered, listened for a few seconds, his face growing even more serious. He hung up and looked at Robert. That was the lawyer for the foreign group. They're filing a lawsuit for breach of contract. They want compensation for losses and damages. And there's more. It's leaked to the press that we suspended the sale. The business journals are already publishing stories saying the Thompson Group is in administrative chaos, that there are internal disputes, that the situation is worse than imagined. Robert closed his eyes. The pressure was mounting from all sides, but he couldn't back down now. Schedule a press conference for tomorrow morning. We're going to be transparent. We'll explain that we've discovered irregularities and are investigating before making any decision about the sale. Robert, that could make the situation even worse, Michael warned. If we publicly admit there's internal fraud, investors will flee, and the banks will tighten credit conditions even further. And if we continue the same lie Fabian built, Robert retorted. No, I'm not hiding anything anymore. My grandfather always said that honesty is the one asset no one can steal from you. If I lose the company, let it be with the truth in my hand. That night, Robert didn't go home. He stayed at the office reviewing documents, trying to understand every move Fabian had made. Around 11 o'clock, only he and Marina remained. Sophia was sleeping on a sofa in the conference room, wrapped in a coat one of the secretaries had kindly lent her. Marina worked, tirelessly, her hands flying over the keyboard even after hours of concentration. You don't have to keep going today, Robert said, approaching her with 2 cups of coffee. It's late. Marina accepted the coffee with a tired smile. I've always worked nights. This schedule is almost normal for me. Besides, the more I look, the more I find. It's like each fraud leads to another. How did you manage to learn all this on your own? Robert asked, sitting in the chair next to her. I mean 3 years of college and then so much time away. Marina took a sip of coffee, her eyes distant. I never really stopped studying. At night, when Sophia was asleep, I'd watch online classes, read articles, keep up with changes in regulations. It was my way of keeping the hope alive that one day I could go back. That one day things would get better. And when I started working here, seeing all these papers, all these spreadsheets, it was like being back in the classroom. Only this time, I was watching from the audience. Robert watched her. There was a strength in this woman that he rarely saw, a resilience forged in hardships he could barely imagine. Raising a daughter alone, working overnight, studying in her spare time, keeping a flame of hope alive amid circumstances that would defeat most people. And yet, there she was, using her knowledge to help save a company that until yesterday didn't even know it was in real danger. Why did you do it? Robert asked. Why did you care? You could have just thrown that paper away and gone on with your life. Marina was silent for a moment, looking at her sleeping daughter through the glass door. Because Sophia taught me that the most important things don't need words to be said. When she brought me that paper with her drawings on top, she was trying to tell me something. She was trying to show me that those numbers were important. And I looked at my daughter, this small, silent child who faces a world not made for her, and I thought, if she can find a way to communicate despite everything, if she can try to help despite having no voice, then so can I. I must. The days that followed were an emotional roller coaster. The press conference was a controlled disaster. Robert publicly admitted that he had discovered accounting irregularities and that the sale was suspended pending a full audit. The headlines were devastating. Minority shareholders filed lawsuits. Some board members, still loyal to Fabian or simply scared by the instability, began to push for the sale to go through, arguing that Robert's transparency had destroyed what was left of the company's value. Fabian reappeared 3 days later, but not alone. He brought his own lawyers, accountants, and even a public relations team. He called an extraordinary board meeting and presented his version of events. According to him, the alleged irregularities were just misinterpretations by Marina, a cleaning lady with no formal credentials, no real experience in large corporations. The numbers she had presented were, according to his experts, incorrect or taken out of context. The offshore transfers were legitimate, part of a wealth protection strategy he had implemented with the board's implicit knowledge. The division in the company became public and brutal. Half the board supported Robert, believing the evidence presented by Marina and Paul Henry. The other half supported Fabian, arguing that Robert was being naive, manipulated by an opportunistic woman who saw a chance to advance herself. Meetings turned into verbal battlefields. Shouts echoed through the hallways. Employees took sides, whispering in the elevators about who was right, who was wrong. Marina became the unwilling center of the storm. She was attacked not only by her detractors within the company, but also by the press. Journalists discovered her story, her humble origins, the fact that she had dropped out of college. Some outlets portrayed her as an unlikely hero. Others painted her as a social climber who had taken advantage of a chaotic situation. Cruel comments circulated on social media. Her appearance was ridiculed. Her past was dissected. They said she wanted to marry Robert, that she had ulterior motives, that she was using her daughter to generate sympathy. Robert saw Marina change during those weeks. The woman who was initially shy and insecure was forced to develop a thick skin. She learned to ignore the disdainful looks from executives when she entered meeting rooms. She learned to respond with hard data when they questioned her competence. She learned to hold her head high when whispers followed her down the corridors. But Robert also saw the moments when that shell cracked, when she thought no one was looking, when she sat alone at her desk late at night. He saw the tears she quickly wiped away, the way her hands trembled as she held a pen. Sophia remained a constant, silent, and observant presence. The company arranged a small room with books and toys for her during the day, and a volunteer employee was responsible for looking after her when Marina needed to be in meetings. But often, Robert would find the girl wandering the hallways, always with her sheets of paper and colored chalk. She drew everything: the people, the offices, the expressions on people's faces during tense meetings. There was a sensitivity in those drawings that unsettled Robert. It was as if Sophia was capturing emotions that words couldn't describe. One day, 3 weeks after that fateful morning, the external auditors finally presented their preliminary report. Robert, Marina, Paul Henry, Michael, and the entire board were present. Even Fabian attended, confident, convinced he would be exonerated. The lead auditor, a 60-year-old man with decades of experience in major corporations, got straight to the point. After a detailed analysis of all financial records from the past 5 years, we have confirmed the existence of systematic manipulation of accounting data. Funds were embezzled, contracts were concealed, and reports were doctored to create a false narrative of financial decline. Preliminary estimates indicate that the damage caused by these actions exceeds $50 million. Furthermore, we have identified communications between Mr. Fabian Mendoza and the foreign buying group dating back more than a year before the crisis became public. These communications suggest a deliberate plan to devalue the company and facilitate its acquisition at a reduced price, with Mr. Mendoza receiving a share of future profits upon resale. The silence in the room was absolute. All eyes turned to Fabian. His face was white, but he still tried to maintain his composure. "This is a biased interpretation. I had the right to explore options for my investments. There's nothing illegal about that." But the auditor wasn't finished. "What makes the situation legally problematic, Mr. Mendoza, is that you used privileged information, manipulated company records for personal gain, and withheld relevant information from other shareholders, including Mr. Thompson, who holds the majority stake. This constitutes not only mismanagement, but potentially crimes against the economic order and embezzlement. We recommend that the case be forwarded to the proper authorities." Fabian stood up abruptly. "So you'll regret this, all of you. I have influential friends, I have resources. I will sue this company, this auditor, and especially you." He pointed at Marina. "You're nothing but a meddling cleaning lady who doesn't know what she's gotten herself into." Marina didn't respond. She just stared at him with a calmness that impressed everyone in the room. It was Robert who spoke, his voice as cold as ice. "Fabian, you have 10 minutes to leave this building. All your credentials will be revoked. Any and all ties you had with this company are terminated. And yes, we will be forwarding everything to the justice system. But unlike you, we will do it through the proper channels, with transparency and within the law." Fabian stormed out of the room, slamming the door, but not before casting one last hateful look at Marina. It was a look that promised retaliation, revenge. Robert felt a chill seeing it. He knew that men like Fabian, accustomed to having power and control, did not accept defeat easily. They especially did not accept being exposed by someone they considered inferior. In the following days, the situation got worse before it got better. Fabian followed, threw on his threat and filed a barrage of lawsuits. He claimed defamation, emotional distress, breach of contract. His lawyers were aggressive, loud, appearing on the media, giving interviews that painted Fabian as the victim of an internal conspiracy. In parallel, the foreign buying group intensified its legal actions, claiming millions in losses from the suspended sale. Banks began to question the company's stability and demanded additional collateral for credit renewals. Key suppliers threatened to break contracts, fearful of not getting paid. Robert was exhausted. He slept only 3 or 4 hours a night, waking up with the weight of the world on his shoulders. But something was different now. He wasn't alone. Marina worked by his side, unraveling each new layer of financial complications that arose. Paul Henry and his team worked tirelessly to reorganize the finances and present the true state of the company to stakeholders. Michael coordinated the legal defense against the multiple lawsuits, and there were moments, brief moments stolen between meetings and crises when Robert and Marina simply talked about their lives, their fears, their dreams. Robert learned that Marina was a widow. Her husband had left when Sophia was just a year old, saying he couldn't handle their daughter's disability. Since then, Marina had raised the girl alone, working 3 different jobs before landing the permanent position at the Thompson Group. She spoke of Sophia with a love so deep it made Robert's heart ache. She told him about the girl's small victories, about how she had developed her own way of communicating through drawings and gestures, about the silent strength that small child showed every day. Robert, in turn, opened up in ways he rarely did. He talked about the pressure of carrying a family legacy, about the loneliness of being at the top, about how he had married young to a woman who only wanted the status and the money, a marriage that had lasted only 3 years and left him cynical about relationships. He talked about his father, about the conversations they would have had if he were still alive, about whether he would be proud or disappointed with the decisions Robert was making. There was a connection growing there, subtle but undeniable. It wasn't just Robert's gratitude or Marina's admiration. It was something deeper, more complex. It was the recognition of 2 people who, coming from completely different worlds, had found each other in the middle of a storm and discovered that their strengths complemented each other perfectly. Marina saw in Robert not the rich and powerful businessman, but the vulnerable man trying to do the right thing despite the personal cost. Robert saw in Marina not the humble employee, but the brilliant and courageous woman who refused to be defined by the circumstances life had dealt her. But both were afraid to name what was growing between them. Marina feared that any involvement would only confirm the accusations that she was an opportunist. She feared losing the autonomy she had gained, feared becoming dependent on someone again. Robert feared judgment, feared that his emotions were clouded by gratitude and the crisis. He feared repeating the mistakes of the past, feared not being able to give Marina and Sophia what they deserved. So, for now, that feeling remained unspoken. It lived in the glances that lingered a second longer than necessary, in the discreet smiles when they passed in the hallways, in the hands that almost touched when reaching for the same document at the same time. It was a romance blooming in silence, waiting for the right moment to be acknowledged. It was Sophia who, in a way, forced the first step. One evening, when Marina had finally convinced her daughter to go to sleep on the conference room sofa, the girl refused to let go of Robert's hand. He had come in to get a document and found them there. Sophia simply took his hand and pulled him to sit beside her. Then, still holding his hand with one of hers and her mother's with the other, she closed her eyes and fell asleep. Marina and Robert stayed there, trapped by the sleeping child between them, not knowing what to say. They looked at each other over Sophia's head, and in that moment, without words, they understood. They understood that what was growing between them was real. It was important, but it was also fragile. It needed time, care, patience, and as hard as it was to wait, they both knew it was the right thing to do, because when the time came to declare themselves, they wanted it to be free of doubt, free from the shadows of the crisis, free to be genuine and lasting. For now they had a company to save, a truth to defend, and a fight ahead. Love could wait. Or at least that's what they told themselves while their hearts insisted otherwise. The months following the exposure of Fabian's fraud were, at once, the most challenging and the most transformative in the history of the Thompson Group. The company had been bleeding for years without anyone noticing, and now Robert faced the Herculean task of stopping the hemorrhage and rebuilding not just the financial structure, but also trust. The trust of employees, partners, investors, and most importantly, the public. Marina was officially integrated into the financial restructuring team. Robert created a special position for her, somewhere between a consultant and an internal auditor, with a commensurate salary and all the benefits her competence deserved. The news generated waves of reactions. Some applauded the initiative as an example of recognizing talent regardless of origin. Others criticized it as disguised nepotism, insinuating there were ulterior motives behind such a rapid promotion. Marina heard it all, but she had learned to filter out the noise. Her work spoke for itself, and she was determined to prove she deserved to be there not by luck or favor, but by pure competence. The first major battle was to regain the trust of the banks. Robert and Marina, accompanied by Paul Henry and Michael, went on a veritable tour of the main creditors. They presented the independent audit reports, showed clear evidence of the fraud, and demonstrated that the company at its core was healthy and profitable. Some banks agreed to renegotiate terms. Others, more conservative or influenced by the ongoing lawsuits, maintained a tough stance. Every meeting was a challenge, every negotiation a test of patience and strategy. Marina was impressive in all these meetings. She always arrived prepared, with data at her fingertips, able to answer any technical question with surgical precision. At first, there was a visible shock on the faces of the bank executives when they realized that this young woman, from a humble background, knew the financial intricacies better than many experienced CFOs. But the shock soon turned to respect. She wasn't intimidated. She didn't apologize for being there. She didn't pretend to be someone she wasn't. She was authentic, direct, and brilliant. And that opened doors. Robert watched Marina grow every day. He saw the transformation not just professionally but personally. She bought clothes more suited to the corporate environment, not to conform but to feel comfortable. She started taking online classes again at night, this time specializing in financial management and compliance. She enrolled Sophia in a private school, specializing in inclusive education, where the girl began to learn ASL and other forms of assistive communication. Seeing Marina flourish, seeing Sophia develop, filled Robert's heart with something he was still afraid to name, but not everything was progress. Fabian's lawsuits moved forward. He had hired a team of expensive lawyers, masters at manipulating the public narrative and creating doubt about the evidence. Their strategy was simple: attack Marina's credibility, question the audit, allege that Robert had orchestrated everything to get rid of a partner who questioned his decisions. It was a dirty tactic, but effective. Sponsored articles appeared on news sites. Fake profiles on social media spread conspiracy theories. The foreign buying group allied with Fabian, providing resources and connections to pressure the company from every possible angle. There was one particularly difficult day when Marina arrived at the office visibly shaken. Robert found her alone in her office, her hands trembling as she held her phone. Someone had created a fake social media profile using old photos of Marina, photos from when she worked in cleaning, and posted offensive messages pretending to be her. They said she sold herself for money, that she used her daughter to manipulate people. Cruel, false things that cut deep. "Marina," Robert said softly, closing the door behind him. "Don't pay attention to this. These are desperate people using vile tactics." But she looked up, and there were tears there she could no longer hold back. "It's not for me, Robert. I can take it. I've been through worse, but today Sophia came home from school crying. Some of the other parents recognized her from the articles, and they said things in front of the children. Other kids repeated it to Sophia, and she can't even defend herself with words. She could only show me through drawings how much it hurt. How do I explain to my daughter that the world can be this cruel? How do I protect her from this?" Robert sat down next to Marina, and without much thought, placed his hand over hers. It was a simple gesture, but laden with meaning. "What you're doing here, what we're doing, is bigger than them. Sophia will understand that one day. She'll understand that her mother didn't bow down, didn't give up, fought for what was right even when it got hard, and that's the greatest example you can give her." Marina squeezed his hand back, and they sat there in silence, sharing that moment of vulnerability. It was then that Robert realized what he felt for this woman wasn't just admiration or gratitude. It was love. A love that had grown slowly, built on a foundation of respect, mutual admiration, and shared moments in the midst of chaos. But he said nothing. It wasn't the time. There were still battles to be won, and they both needed clear heads. The turning point in public perception came unexpectedly. An investigative journalist from a major publication decided to do an in-depth report on the case. She wasn't content with the press releases from Fabian's lawyers. She went after the real data, spoke with the audit team, analyzed documents, interviewed employees. The article that came out was devastating for Fabian. It exposed the fraud scheme in detail, showed the irrefutable evidence, and contextualized how Marina had been the key to the discovery. More importantly, it humanized the story. It told about Sophia, about the courage of a single mother, about how a silent gesture from a child saved thousands of jobs. The reaction was immediate. Other publications picked up the story and delved deeper. Television programs wanted interviews. Robert and Marina were cautious, accepting only reputable outlets and always focusing on the facts, not the personal drama. But the narrative had shifted. From villains and opportunists, Marina and Robert became symbols of resistance and integrity. Sophia, the mute girl with her chalk-stained hands, became a symbol of hope. With the tide of public opinion turning, Fabian's lawsuits began to lose steam. Some were dismissed, for lack of evidence. In others, judges were already signaling that the accusations lacked merit. The foreign group, realizing their pressure tactics had failed, tried one last gambit. They offered to buy the company for a fair value, this time without the previous abusive conditions. It was a tempting proposal. With the money, Robert could pay off all the debts, compensate for the losses caused by Fabian, and still walk away with a significant profit. The board was divided. Half thought it was time to sell, seize the opportunity, and move on. The other half wanted to continue believing in the potential for recovery. Robert called a meeting with only his inner circle: Paul Henry, Michael, Marina, and a few trusted directors. "What do you all think?" Robert asked, genuinely torn. "From a financial standpoint, does it make sense to accept?" Paul Henry adjusted his glasses, looking at the projections on the screen. "It does make sense. It would be a safe exit, but it would also be the end of the Thompson Group as we know it. The buying group has a history of aggressive restructuring. They'll lay people off, they'll change everything, they'll turn the company into something else." Marina, who had been quiet until then, spoke up. "Can I say something? Maybe I don't have the right, I'm the newest one here, but—" She hesitated, then continued with more firmness. "When I found that paper in the trash, when Sophia showed me those numbers, I didn't fully understand what it meant. But I knew it was important. I knew it could change something. And when I decided to bring it here, I wasn't thinking about saving a company. I was thinking about the people, the 3,000 people who work here, who depend on these jobs, the families behind each number. If we sell now, from a financial perspective, it might be smart, but we'll be handing over the fate of all these people to someone who doesn't care about them. We'll be saying that a 62-year legacy can be reduced to a number in a bank account." The silence that followed was profound. Robert looked at Marina and saw in her eyes the same determination he had seen that first morning, when she was out of place and nervous in a room full of executives. Only now that determination was accompanied by confidence, by a certainty of her place there. Michael was the one who broke the silence. "Marina is right. And there's another point. If we sell now, Fabian technically wins. He managed to devalue the company, tried to force a sale, and even if he didn't get exactly what he wanted, he gets to influence the decision to the very end. It would be giving him a moral victory." Robert nodded slowly. "You're both right, and I don't want to sell either. Not now, not like this. But then we need a plan, a real plan for recovery, for growth. We can't just survive. We need to thrive." And so the reconstruction project was born. Robert invested his own resources in the company, selling some personal assets to inject capital. Marina led a complete overhaul of the financial processes, implementing systems of transparency and control that made it virtually impossible to repeat what Fabian had done. Paul Henry renegotiated contracts with suppliers, seeking more advantageous partnerships. Michael resolved the last of the lawsuits, some through settlements, others through victories in court as the evidence became undeniable. But the project went beyond the financial. Robert decided the company needed a greater purpose. He announced the creation of the Thompson Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to supporting single mothers and children with disabilities. Marina was invited to be on the board of directors. A portion of the company's profits would be allocated to the foundation. The old administrative building in Newport, where it all began with his grandfather Sebastian, was transformed into a social support center, offering daycare, specialized education, career guidance, and psychological support. The story of Sophia and Marina became the symbol of the company's new phase. Advertising campaigns showed that the Thompson Group valued people, stories, second chances. It wasn't empty marketing. It was genuine, and people noticed. Bookings began to increase. Guests said they felt good staying at a chain that demonstrated real values. Companies started seeking out the Thompson Group for corporate events, wanting to be associated with that image of social responsibility. Within 6 months, the financial situation had stabilized. Within a year, the company was profitable again, not just surviving, but growing. Robert received offers from investors wanting to get in on the business. This time, with fair terms and respect for the company's vision, he accepted a few, carefully selected, who shared the values that now guided the Thompson Group. Throughout this process, the relationship between Robert and Marina continued to evolve, but always behind the scenes, always discreet. They worked side by side almost every day. They often had dinner together, but always with the excuse of discussing work. Robert started picking Sophia up from school when Marina had meetings that ran late. The girl became attached to him in a way that surprised everyone. She, who was so reserved, so cautious with strangers, was different with Robert. She held his hand with confidence, showed him her drawings, and asked with gestures for him to read her stories. One afternoon, Robert was at the park with Sophia while Marina finished a meeting. The girl was playing on the swings and Robert pushed her gently, listening to her silent laughter. An elderly woman sitting on a nearby bench commented, "Your daughter is beautiful. You and her mother make a lovely couple." Robert was speechless. He didn't know how to correct her, and he realized he didn't want to. He didn't want to deny it. Because in that moment, pushing Sophia on the swing as the autumn sun painted New York in gold, he wished deeply that it were true. He wished that Marina and Sophia were his family. He wished he could call this his, without fear, without barriers, without the shadows of the crisis still hanging over them. It was around this time that international news began to talk about a new crisis in the hospitality sector. A fictional pandemic, for the purposes of this story, was beginning to affect global tourism. Empty airports, closing borders, cancelled events. It was an external threat, different from the internal sabotage they had faced, but it was just as dangerous. Hotels around the world began to shut their doors. Major chains announced mass layoffs. Robert convened the team. This time they would face the crisis together, strengthened by what they had overcome. Marina already had a plan drafted. Diversification. Transforming some hotels into long-term remote work locations for companies that needed to isolate teams. Offering packages for families wanting to get away from urban centers. Partnerships with hospitals to house healthcare professionals. It was creative, it was bold, and it required agility. Those weeks were intense. Nights turned into days. Decisions had to be made in hours. But something was different now. There was trust. There was a united team. And there was, between Robert and Marina, a partnership that transcended the professional. They understood each other without words, anticipated each other's reactions, complemented each other perfectly. It was during one of those late nights when they were alone in the office reviewing contracts that Robert finally said what he had wanted to say for a long time. "Marina, I need to tell you something. And maybe this isn't the best time, with everything that's happening, but if I don't say it now, I don't think I'll ever have the courage." Marina looked up, her heart racing. "Robert?" He stood up, walked over to her, and with a courage he didn't know he possessed, said, "I've fallen in love with you. I don't know when it happened exactly. Maybe it was gradual over all these months. Or maybe it was that first morning when you had the courage to show me that paper despite all the fear. I fell in love with your intelligence, your strength, your kindness, with the way you love Sophia, the way you face the world without backing down. And I know you might think it's too soon, or that I'm confusing gratitude with love, or that there are 1,000 practical complications. But I needed you to know, because you deserve to know that you are loved. Deeply, genuinely loved." Marina was silent for a moment that felt like an eternity. Then slowly, she stood up too. Her hands were trembling slightly. "Robert, I've fallen in love with you too, and I confess I was scared. Scared that this was just your gratitude. Scared of losing my autonomy. Scared that people would say this was why I helped. But the truth is, you showed me that it's possible to be strong and vulnerable at the same time. That it's possible to have power and still have humility. You accepted Sophia without reservation, loved her before you even thought of me. And that—" She paused, the tears finally falling. "That means everything to me." They kissed there, amidst the scattered papers, the still-lit computer screens, the survival plans spread across the table. It was a kiss full of promises, of hopes, of everything they had held back for so long. And when they parted, they were both crying and smiling at the same time. But they knew that the declaration of love didn't solve everything. There was still a crisis to face. There were still difficult decisions ahead. But now they would face them together, officially, openly together. And that certainty, that union, would be the strength that would carry them through the storm that was still to come. The global crisis that befell the hospitality sector was relentless and indiscriminate. Major international chains, with decades of history and seemingly infinite resources, saw their revenues plummet overnight. Governments imposed travel restrictions. Events were cancelled en masse. The tourism industry plunged into one of the worst crises in its history. But the Thompson Group, forged in the fire of betrayal and near bankruptcy, was better prepared than most. The strategies Marina had proposed, initially seen as risky by some board members, proved to be visionary. While other hotels were closing rooms and entire floors, the Thompson Group transformed parts of its properties into long-term remote workspaces. Tech companies, needing to keep teams isolated but functional, rented entire floors for months. Healthcare professionals who needed lodging near hospitals but wanted to keep their families safe found a humane and accessible solution at the Thompson Group. Robert made a decision that seemed insane at the time, but defined the character of the company's new phase. No employee would be laid off. Even with the drastic drop in revenue, he refused to cut jobs. Instead, he implemented a rotation system where employees worked fewer hours, but everyone kept their positions. He used part of his personal savings to cover payroll in the first few months. Marina reorganized the finances so that every dollar was maximized, cutting unnecessary expenses but preserving the essential. The decision had a profound impact. Employees who could have been lost to the competition stayed. Loyalty grew, and when the crisis began to subside, when restrictions were gradually lifted, the Thompson Group had something its competitors no longer had: a full, experienced, motivated, and grateful team. While others struggled to rehire and retrain, the Thompson Group was ready to resume with full force. The relationship between Robert and Marina, now public and acknowledged, generated mixed reactions. Some saw it as an inspiring love story, a modern fairy tale where the prince and Cinderella met not at a ball, but amidst spreadsheets and audits. Others remained cynical, suggesting Marina had calculated everything from the start, that Robert was being manipulated. But to those who knew them truly, who worked with them daily, it was obvious that it was genuine. The way they looked at each other, supported each other, made decisions together, showed a partnership built on a solid foundation of respect and true love. Sophia blossomed in ways Marina had never imagined possible. The specialized school, with teachers trained in inclusive education, revealed talents that had been there all along, just waiting for the right environment to emerge. Sophia began using an alternative communication board, an electronic device that allowed her to select pre-programmed words and phrases. For the first time, she could express complex thoughts, make jokes, tell stories. But her drawings remained her favorite form of expression. Now, however, they were accompanied by captions she typed herself. One of her drawings became the official logo of the Thompson Foundation. It was a simple but powerful image, hands of different sizes and colors joining around a colorful heart. Sophia had created it one afternoon when Robert asked what the foundation meant to her. The image was replicated on promotional materials, on plaques at the foundation's facilities, in awareness campaigns. And every time Robert saw that drawing, he felt a deep emotion. That child, who had been the spark that saved everything, continued to be the light that guided their path. 18 months after that rainy September morning, when Sophia handed him the crumpled paper, the Thompson Group had not only survived 2 successive crises, but was stronger than ever. Revenues had returned to pre-crisis levels. New investors, this time aligned with the company's values, had come in with capital for expansion. Plans were underway to open 3 new properties, one of them in Charleston, South Carolina, the hometown of his grandfather Sebastian before he moved to Newport. It was at this moment of hard-won stability, of celebrated victories, that Robert decided it was time. He and Marina had talked about marriage months before, but both had agreed to wait. They wanted to be sure they were making the decision for the right reasons, not because of the adrenaline of the crisis or mutual gratitude, but for genuine, lasting love. And now, with the dust settled, with the waters calm, they knew. They knew they wanted to build a life together, officially, before everyone. The proposal was simple and perfect. Robert didn't organize a grand spectacle, didn't rent out expensive restaurants or hire musicians. Instead, he took Marina and Sophia to Newport, to the original inn where it had all begun decades ago. The place had been preserved as a family historical landmark, a small museum that told the story of the Thompsons. They walked along the beach at sunset, Sophia running ahead collecting seashells, Marina holding hands with Robert. It was there, with their feet in the sand and the sound of the waves in the background, that Robert knelt. He had no ring prepared, no rehearsed speech, just words from the heart. "Marina, you and Sophia have given me something I didn't know I needed. A family, a purpose that goes beyond numbers and profits, a reason to wake up every day and want to be a better man. I want to spend the rest of my life with you two. I want to be the father Sophia deserves. I want to be the husband you deserve. Will you marry me?" Marina didn't even have to think. "Yes," she said, tears streaming freely. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." Sophia, who had realized what was happening, ran back and threw herself into their arms. The 3 of them stood there, embracing as the sun set over the Newport. Sea painting the sky in oranges and pinks. It was a perfect moment, not because it was cinematic, but because it was real. It was theirs. The wedding was planned for 6 months later, enough time to organize everything without rush. Marina wanted something simple but meaningful. She didn't want to show off, didn't want to turn it into a media spectacle. She just wanted to celebrate with the people who truly mattered. Robert completely agreed. They chose the garden of the Social Support Center in Newport, the old administrative building transformed into a symbol of hope. The venue could hold 200 people, and the guest list was carefully thought out. Employees who had been with them throughout the journey, members of the restructuring team, families served by the Thompson Foundation. There was no segregation between executives and operational staff. Everyone was there as equals, celebrating not just the union of 2 people, but the union of a community that had weathered storms together. Sophia would be the flower girl, of course. She was radiant in her white dress, hand-picked by herself, a creation with embroidered butterflies that had been her one demand. Marina wore a simple but elegant dress, no veil, no frills, just her in her natural beauty. Robert was in a navy blue suit, the same one his father had worn at his own wedding decades ago, a way to honor the legacy while building something new. The ceremony was emotional. Michael, the childhood friend and lawyer, served as the master of ceremonies. Paul Henry gave a speech recalling how a crumpled piece of paper had changed all their destinies. Employees shared stories about how the decision not to lay anyone off during the crisis had impacted their lives. A single mother, helped by the foundation, spoke about how the support she received allowed her to return to her studies and get a better job. But the moment everyone remembered, the moment that made even the toughest cry, happened during the exchange of vows. Robert spoke first, his voice choked but firm, promising to love and care for Marina and Sophia for the rest of his days. Marina responded with words that came from the depths of her soul, thanking him for seeing in her more than a cleaning lady, for seeing a partner, an equal, someone capable of standing beside him, not behind or in front, but side by side. Then, before the officiant declared them husband and wife, something unexpected happened. Sophia, who was standing next to her mother holding a small bouquet, pulled out her communication board. Her small fingers navigated the device with a precision learned through months of practice. She selected words, formed a sentence, and then held up the device for everyone to see the screen. The illuminated words read, "Can I call you Dad now?" The silence that followed was absolute. Robert, who had remained composed until then, felt tears stream down his face uncontrollably. He knelt to Sophia's level, took her, small hands in his, and said with a broken voice, "Sophia, it would be the greatest honor of my life to be called Dad by you, and I promise, here in front of all these people, that I will spend every day trying to deserve that title." Sophia dropped the board and threw herself into his arms, and there, in that silent yet eloquent embrace, the true union of that family took place. There were no blood ties, but there was something stronger. There was choice. There was a love that didn't ask biology for permission to exist. There was the recognition that family isn't just who gives birth to us, but who chooses to stay, who chooses to love, who chooses not to give up when things get hard. The years that followed were of constant growth and purpose. The Thompson Group expanded to 15 new cities, always maintaining its commitment to its core values. Each new property reserved part of its space for social programs. The Thompson Foundation served thousands of families, offering not just assistance, but real opportunities for transformation. Marina completed her master's degree in financial administration, continuing her work at the company while studying. Sophia grew up strong and confident, her drawings evolving from colored chalk on crumpled paper to digital artworks that were exhibited in galleries. She never gained a voice in the conventional sense, but she learned that there are many ways to speak, and all are equally valid. Fabian tried for years to reverse his legal situation, but the evidence was irrefutable. He was convicted of fraud and embezzlement, serving part of his sentence in a halfway house before being released years later. Robert, despite having every right to celebrate, felt only a deep sadness, not for justice being served, but for the waste. Fabian had had so much, had been part of something significant, and had thrown it all away for greed and pride. It was a reminder that true value isn't in what we accumulate, but in what we build with others. Robert never forgot the lessons of those turbulent days. He learned that salvation rarely comes from expected places. He learned that true strength isn't in never falling, but in getting up and continuing. He learned that love can grow in the most unlikely of places, and that when it's genuine, when it's built on respect and partnership, it becomes unshakable. One spring morning, 10 years after that rainy September, Robert woke up early. Marina was still asleep beside him, her face peaceful in the dim light of the room. He got up carefully so as not to wake her and walked to his home office. There, framed on the main wall, was that crumpled piece of paper, the paper with Sophia's childish drawings and the numbers that revealed a hidden truth. It was protected now, preserved as the most important artifact in the company's history. More important than certificates, awards, or financial achievements, he looked at it for a long moment, remembering everything. The desperation of that morning, the child entering the room with chalk-stained hands, the moment he almost signed those papers, how such a small gesture had averted such a great catastrophe. And he felt a profound gratitude, not just for the saved company or the love he found, but for the most important lesson of all, that the greatest acts of heroism are not always loud. Sometimes they are silent. Sometimes they come from those we least expect. Sometimes they are just a child, holding out a crumpled piece of paper, believing that it matters. And it did matter. Oh, how it mattered. Robert heard footsteps behind him and turned. Sophia was there, now 15, tall for her age, her brown hair now long to her waist. She held her communication board in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other. She offered him the coffee with a smile. Robert accepted, and together they stood there, looking at that paper on the wall. Sophia typed on her board, "Do you still remember that day?" Robert smiled. "Every day, Sophia. Every day I remember, and I'm thankful." She typed again, more slowly this time, choosing her words carefully. "My teacher asked what I want to be when I grow up. I said I want to do what you and Mom do, not run a hotel, but give chances to people no one sees. Help people who think they have no value discover that they do." Robert felt his heart swell with pride. "You already do that, Sophia. You've been doing it since you were 8, and you're going to do even greater things. I'm sure of it." Marina appeared at the door, yawning, in her robe with her hair tousled. "Are you two conspiring? This early? What time is it?" "Time to remember how lucky we are," Robert said, opening his arms. Marina came into the hug, Sophia too, and the three of them stood there, a family formed not by blood or destiny, but by choice and love. A family that had faced storms and come out stronger. A family built on foundations of truth, respect, and the courage to believe that good things can come from the most unlikely places. Outside, New York was waking up to another day, the noisy, chaotic city, full of stories being written every second. And amidst millions of lives, these three people knew they had something rare. They had each other. They had a story to tell. And they had the certainty that no matter what the future held, they would face it together. The story that began with silence ended with silence too. But it was a different silence now. It wasn't the silence of despair or resignation. It was the silence of peace, of completeness, of the certainty that sometimes we don't need words to say everything that matters. Sometimes it's enough to be present, it's enough to choose to stay, it's enough to love unconditionally and fight for those we love without holding back. And if you were to ask Robert what the moment was that changed everything, he wouldn't point to the dramatic meetings or the financial discoveries. He would point to that simple instant when a little girl with colorful hands held out a crumpled piece of paper. Because that's where it all began. That's where salvation came, not with fanfare or grandeur, but with a small silent gesture that echoed through the years and changed not just a company, but lives, destinies, futures. And Sophia, who started it all without knowing, who never had a voice in the traditional sense, but who spoke louder than anyone through her actions, grew up knowing that her difference was not a limitation. It was a superpower. It was the ability to see what others ignored, to value what others discarded, to believe that small things can have enormous meanings. The Thompson Group continued to prosper. The Thompson Foundation touched thousands of lives. Robert, Marina, and Sophia lived through days of joy and days of challenges, as every family does, but they always remained united, because they knew where they came from. They knew the price of betrayal and the value of loyalty. They knew that success measured only in figures is empty, but success measured in transformed lives is eternal. And every time Robert walked into one of the chain's properties, every time he saw the employees at work, every time he heard a story of someone helped by the foundation, he remembered. He remembered Marina cleaning hallways in the dead of night, studying in every spare moment, never giving up on her dreams. He remembered Sophia finding that paper in the trash and having the wisdom to recognize its importance. He remembered almost losing everything by trusting the wrong people. And he remembered gaining everything by giving a chance to the right ones. The legacy of the Thompsons was no longer just about hotels or hospitality. It was about human dignity. It was about recognizing value in unexpected places. It was about understanding that everyone deserves a second chance, an opportunity to show their potential, a space to shine. And that legacy, built on the ashes of a near tragedy, transformed by the hands of a courageous woman and the silent gestures of an extraordinary child, that legacy would live on for generations. The story of how a company was saved by a crumpled paper and a mute girl became legendary. It was told in business schools as an example of corporate integrity. It was cited in motivational speeches as proof that heroism comes in all forms. It was whispered among employees as a reminder that everyone, absolutely everyone, has value and the potential to make a difference. And Robert, Marina, and Sophia continued to live, to love, to build. Not like a fairy tale story where everything is perfect, but like a real story where love is constant work, where challenges arise but are faced together, where victories are celebrated but never taken for granted. They lived with humility, with gratitude, and with the deep awareness that they had received a rare gift, the chance to start over, the chance to do things differently, the chance to prove that sometimes the greatest miracles come wrapped in the most unlikely packages. And if you ask any of them what the key was, the answer would be simple. It wasn't genius, it wasn't luck, it was paying attention, it was valuing what others discarded. It was having the courage to believe in small gestures and invisible people. It was understanding that the answers we seek are sometimes right under our noses, drawn in colored chalk by small hands that have more to teach than we can ever imagine. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Robert, Marina, and Sophia has touched your heart deeply. If you are moved by this journey of courage, love, and second chances, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments which moment resonated with you the most. Was it when Sophia handed over the crumpled paper? When Marina faced prejudice with dignity? When Robert chose truth over profit? Or when Sophia called Robert Dad for the first time? Every day we bring you intense and touching stories like this one, which reveal the deepest side of the human soul and show that true heroes don't always wear capes or make noise. Sometimes they simply extend a hand, offer a gesture of hope, and silently change the world. We look forward to seeing you in the next episode with another story that will stir your emotions and make you believe that no matter where you come from or what obstacles you face, there is always a chance for transformation when we have the courage to take the first step. Until the next story.